Tikina atu rā te pūtaki o nā korero i tēnei wānanga. Tikina atu rā te hautapu o nā āriki kauwhatete e tani te wānanga. Kei runga ki nei ruanuku kia koi te matapūninga, mai ngai te matapu iho iho whakamaua ki a tīna, homia hui e tāki. Ko Rob Small taku ingoa, ko nā tauki matawhaurua Te Waka, ko whakatere manawa kai ai a te maunga ko hokianga nui a kupe te moana, ko moihau te awa. Ko tuhirangi te marae, ko nāpui te iwi, ko mahurihuri te hapū, ko raheri te tangata, tēnā koutou. Nā mihi nui ki a koe whaia mō te haramai ki tēnei tangata, kua tai mai i tēnei rā. Nā mihi ki nā tēnei māti o tēnei rohi. Apiti hono tātai hono te honga mati ki te honga mati. Apiti hono tātai hono te honga ora ki te honga ora no reira. Ki nā tangata ki a tai mai. I tēnei rā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. I want to talk today as a introduction and opportunity for us to talk together about the whole principle of hua Parakore, which is now beginning to become widespread through many iwi and many marae across the country. And I have to say that as an old gardener, I'm really thrilled to see the return of many māra that are coming back into our marae. And it's really important to understand that there's a whole movement worldwide which is about slow food, fast food to slow food. That thing of it's just as quick to prepare a nice stir fry as it is to go down the road to Miki Tāngara and get yourself a hamburger or whatever else. So this is about our hauora, about the health of our people. I have to say that although I'm Ngāpui because of my heritage, I've been whānauid to this mob, Ngā Te Whātua Ōrake. And that's because I've been working with them for now about 7 or 8 years, first as an independent board member of their Whaimaia board, but secondly developing this wonderful garden at Korero, which is right in the middle of the city, and which I hope will become an ethnobotanic garden, a garden that demonstrates how we use the foods as people over the centuries and going back in time. So this is about certainly about kai, but also about rongoa, also about rāranga, and about how we understood so well the science of our soils and the goodness that was in them. And at the very heart of what I've come to understand, and please, I'm not an expert, I'm somebody who has encountered this journey, and I'm happy to share this information with all of you. But what I've come to understand in Te Ao Māori, in that Maori world, everything starts from the whenua. This is papatua nuku and hini ahu one. So it's about understanding that, and that everything in our world is interconnected somehow. So everything is interdependent. And when we mess in our modern world with those connections, we really create some very unexpected and unpleasant results. So it's really important to come back to first principles. So in our soil, we understand that that everything has a whakapapa, from an earthworm to a kumara to anything that's in there. Even the rocks around my garden, we have rocks from Mangawhau, where they've drilled a tunnel underneath, and Mangawhau is one of our important maunga in Orake. So we've used those rocks to create the curved part of the garden. The second thing that's important in any soil is mauri. And mauri is that life essence. And we say if that's in the soil, in our food, it's in our people. And that's about hauora. So, and then the third thing about soils is every soil has a wairua, has a spirit. And so understanding those things, the first principle in hua parakore, or indeed in gardening in any way, is to understand that. You know that our old people had over 50 kupu for types of soil and rock. And when they made their soils, they amended them. And when Cook sailed around Aotearoa at the time and looked across at those gardens in the East Cape and up that coast, he noted just how perfect those little puke were where they grew their kumara and their iwai. And what he also noted was just the sheer sophistication of that. And Banks and Solander were the two botanists on the boat, and they came ashore and looked at some of those things. So, and I've got an illustration here, not of Pauriwa, but of a wonderful garden which has been developed by Wiremu Puke in the Hamilton Gardens. And this is a collection of the puke as they would have been set out. And you know, they were absolutely perfectly aligned so that they formed like a 5 on a dice. And so you could look down there and the rows were very exact. But the important thing was that, and this is my theory, that these puke would have been developed like that because they took such care to amend those soils after they'd burnt off the bracken or whatever was there and used that ash as kai for the food. What they were doing was actually encouraging that whole mauri, that whole wairua in the soil, all of those bacteria and fungi and protozoa. Of course they didn't know those kupu, but that's what they were doing. But they brought in and highly amended those things. So can you imagine if they did a whole area that high across a whole patch, how much work that was? Or even if they did a whole furrow, much easier to do little puke. So I think that's how it developed. It makes sense to me, at least. But the key message to understand is that they were very sophisticated in their understanding of horticulture. You know, we often suffer because people consider that we had that warrior gene, and that we were warriors, or that we were somehow to the colonialists second-class citizens in a way. And I don't apologise for that, because that is very evident from what we read and what we hear about. And of course the whole thing about colonialism is we know best, so we're going to make you just like us. And of course, if you know anything about navigation, the fastest boats on the Pacific were definitely those from the islands, because they had catamarans. It's a bit like the story of the New Zealand America's Cup Challenge, the big boat against the big catamaran. And when one of the Tahitian men was showing Cook the way to the Marquesas, he would sail off into the distance and then come back and circle around Cook and go off again into the distance. So don't kid yourself that they weren't wonderful navigators, wonderful mariners, and people who had very sophisticated knowledge, and we inherited that. So let me just talk a bit about Hua Parakore. I don't know, is the sun reflecting off that? Can you see that okay, folks?
Carry on.
Talk to Robert. Okay. So Hua Parakore really has its roots here in Tai Tokerau. And in fact, Percy Tiffany from Ngāti Hine and others, Geneva Hildreth, and there were a lot of other people who were involved. They started a movement called Topis, and this was because Percy believed that people needed to be independent of the supermarket. They needed to be able to feed themselves. And if there's anybody here who knows more about this, please correct me, because I'm quite happy for that to happen. But it was Topis that started a movement of really getting people to garden in the old way and to understand the tikanga and the mātauranga that was around that. And that is what created a real movement. And so it would have been Pautu was one place they were working, certainly here in down there in Ngāti Hine, and I think up north. And so Topis was the movement. And then Percy Ma went to Ratana to get an endorsement to, in fact, create a Maori Organic Food Production Authority for Aotearoa. So this was the movement that started, and that was endorsed at Ratana. And so for about 10 years that movement flourished, and then unfortunately Percy passed. And Percy was a bigger than life figure in more ways than one, and he was a real driver. You know, sometimes when you get movements, it takes somebody who from the outside looks a little crazy. Well, he wasn't crazy, he was very smart, but what he knew was that it took real leadership to create a movement, to make a change. So this was Percy. So there was really a period of some years when this whole movement fell into like an abyss. And my journey is that I've been a parks director most of my life in Whangārei, and also regional parks in Tamaki Makaurau, or the Greater Auckland area. And so I had an interest in, particularly in botanic gardens. I learned to garden at my father's knee when I was still in three-cornered pants. And so I really began to marry together two things in my retirement. One was I wanted to really understand my Māori roots. You know, we all get on that journey sooner or later. I was one of the ones who got on it later. But as I moved on that journey and started to learn te reo and tikanga, and you know the best way to learn te reo is with tikanga, to understand what it is when we have a tangi, or what it is when we discover the differences between Te Ao Whānau and Te Ao Māori. So it was on that journey that I started working for my adopted iwi, Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, and became aware that they wanted to create this garden. And at that time I tried to find some thread into Te Waka Kai Ora, which is the Maori Organic Food Production Authority. And I just couldn't get in there anyway. But I discovered a book by Jessica Hutchings, which was the kind of the primer on the production of food, the production of mahinga kai, the food of our atua. And so because I understood that, I made contact with Jessica, and about that time Te Waka Kai Ora was being revived. And being revived thanks to the good work of people like Pounamu Skelton and certainly Jessica Hutchings and her wife Jo Smith, and and many other people. Janita Hildreth, who was from up north, from Kaiho originally. And so those people brought the thing back to life. So we started the program probably 3 years ago. So this is the tohu of Parakore, and it's represented by this particular diagram, which suggests that there are 6 strings to Parakore. And they're very important to understand because in a way they're deeply embedded in the way that we were, in that tikanga, in all of those practices we had. Unfortunately, one of the best texts you can find around Maori agriculture was written by a European, and I got a book out of the library at Unitec, and people had written all over it because there were some fairly outdated thoughts about our people. However, the thing that really stuck with me in that was how important these principles were in the production of kai. So we've had an artist develop these 6 symbols of Parakore, and the first one is whakapapa, which is about a connection to the natural world, but it's also understanding who has walked on this whenua. Hey. So in the case of Ngāti Whātua, that was pretty easy to understand because Tūperiri came from the kaipara, and he conquered the Wairua people in Tamaki, and Kiwi Tamaki was slain in that particular battle or series of battles, and so they had occupation of that land from that time. And so for Ngāti Whātua we can easily understand that we go back to Te Ao and a number of other hapū. And we also understand the land being gradually dispossessed by the government in spite of declarations by the Maori Land Court and by the government that land, that 600 acres that was the Tamaki block, was to be inalienable. And it now sits there as those rich houses on Paratai Drive and many other places. So, and the story behind that is that our chief Apihai Te Kauau at the time, who signed the treaty, there was a fairly lawless condition in the country at the time, or prior to signing the treaty, which led the northern tribes to sign the Declaration of Independence with Queen Victoria in 1835. But it was still relatively lawless. You know that Korero was a pretty lawless place as the capital of Aotearoa at the time, when Hobson established that as the first capital city. So Tūperiri sent emissaries to Hobson and said, we'd like you to come and set up your capital city here in Tamaki, and which he did. And he gave 3,000 acres of land for the establishment of Tamaki Makaurau, which he called Auckland. But the signing of the treaty was really a very critical point, because New Zealand could have been governed and taken over by the French just as easily at that time. And what the Maori tribes were trying to do was to bring some law and order, just the same as Tūperiri did in trying to bring the capital city to Tamaki so that there could be some law and order. So whakapapa is really important to understand, so that you know on whose land you walk, on what is the history of that land. And so whakapapa is also important to understand that everything has a whakapapa and everything is connected in some way. The second principle is about mana, and mana is the vehicle of justice. So in the māra we're very careful about how we treat people, I guess, how we look at the issues of reciprocity. So you bring a koha when you come to visit me, and I bring a koha when I go to visit you. And if I do some deed for you, you do some deed for me. And in the case of Ngāti Whātua, there was a time when my people from Ngāpuhi were raiding Auckland fairly frequently, so they fled to the Waikato. And they kept the ahi ka by continuing to sneak back and garden and to fish and to do those things that are important to maintain ahi ka. But in return, Ngāti Whātua gave Tainui some land. So there was reciprocity. So understanding mana and justice is really important. I don't think I need to say too much to most of you about māramatanga or māramataka, which is that cycle of the moon. And it's something that I've represented in my design of Pauriwa. But understanding, I guess I heard this term first from an Aborigine, a Kuri person in Victoria in Australia. And he said it's really important that we understand and follow the flow of the land. This is like what happens in this season and this season and this season. They talk about 6 seasons. For us, if you listen to Reria Te Mahaka, he will talk about seasons as well, and he will talk about summer having 2 seasons. And so understanding seasons, understanding the flow of the land, they're also very important to us. And māramataka, of course, or māramatanga, is about that cycle of the moon and understanding each of those kainga of the moon and what energies are present then. It's amazing to me that throughout the motu, people established this understanding of māramataka or māramatanga. And I know some modern scholars have actually kept diaries of people like, are you feeling mawiwi? Are you feeling a bit hoha today? Or are you feeling full of energy? And you know, those things are absolutely consistent. Now there's nothing, although this is a Pacific concept, and certainly a Maori concept, you can talk about original cultures across the world that have this system of understanding of energies that come with different tides and different days. And so a real challenge for us in the modern garden is, do we only plant on those favourable days? And do we only harvest? Well, I'll tell you something about zucchini. You leave those for a month and you could build a house in them. So you've got to harvest when you, so needs must. So the thing that we've adopted in many places is to understand that there's our original food and there's food that's grown in the ground and has a period of growth. That could be carrot, certainly kumara, riwai, some of those things. We plant those always strictly according to māramatanga. But other times, when we know we've just got to get things in the ground because we've got people to feed, then we're less observant of that with what I would call Pākehā kai, that kai that came with the colonialists. And that must have been, for our people, just such a wonderful thing to have, to have those new foods to grow. And I know that it's been said many times that our Māori people were wonderful gardeners. They certainly were. You know, there was a time when around the maunga in Tāmaki Makaurau there was over 3,000 acres of kai being grown by Māori. They were feeding most of certainly the area around Tāmaki Makaurau, but it was being exported to Sydney, to Poihakana. So it's important to understand those things But you know, the thing that dumbs all of that down is fishing calendars and the like. Because our people never relied just on that. They would have relied on other tohu at the time. So it may have been, excuse me, the position of the sunrise, the flowering of a particular tree, a prevalence of a certain wind. Ririata talks about foam on the water, those things that happen in cycles. And so, just as modern science does, Maori science triangulates those tohu and says, okay, now's the time to do that. So that's māramatanga. Te Ao Tūroa is the fourth principle, and it really is one that I think is top of mind for us at the moment, because it is about understanding just how that whole world is connected. And in the last 150 years, we've lost the plot completely. So we've begun to meddle with those things that make the world work. And for us as Māori, I think there's a really important issue which is about this whole talk of GMO and how this genetically modified product is said to be able to feed more people or overcome disease or whatever else. But it meddles with the natural order. So for us, just one of those things about that particular element of Te Ao Tūroa is not to meddle with those things. And so to keeping our own seed, really important. You know, if our tupuna hadn't done that, then they would have run out of kai, because they couldn't go down to Bunnings and get another packet. So storing food, the way they did all those things, again, that's the natural way, and that's what we have to think about. So how are those things connected? I suppose the most important principle in Te Waka Kai Ora for me is about having really healthy soils. There's a difference between dirt and soil, right? If you look around here, I can see plenty of wonderful soil. And that's because that soil is imbued, excuse me again, with a total population of microorganisms, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, a little thing called a tardigrade, earthworms, and they all interact. And believe it or not, although we may have understood intuitively that that good mauri in the soil creates healthy food, it's understanding that that is because we have nourished the soil well. And so that's a really important thing to understand. I think Māori is, you know, te toto o te tangata he kai, te hauora o te tangata he whenua. So if the soil is healthy, the people will be healthy. And, you know, I think there are challenges, you know, about not using any of those chemicals, Roundup or whatever else. But there are better ways of doing it, and creating healthy plants repels disease and repels insects. So those are important things to understand. And finally, an important element in any garden is the principle of wairua. Now, wairua is really, for me, about maintaining people's wairua and keeping them safe and healthy. So we never allow any raru in the garden. We say, you fellows have got a disagreement, out of here. Get out of the garden and sort it out. Because those things disturb the Māori, but they don't keep our people safe either. And that's a really important point about how we care for people. You know, some of those old things in Elsden Best's book that I referred to early, Maori Agriculture, was really how ritualized gardening was. And that was because you couldn't afford to make a mistake, because you had to have those crops to feed your whānau for the following year until you could grow them again. So those things, excuse me, are really important. So that's the that's my summary of Hua Parakore. And for my sins, I've been invited onto the board of Te Waka Kai Ora. But if anybody wants to hear more about that, you can go online, tewakakaiora.co.nz/what is Hua Parakore. So you can find that online, but I'm always happy to talk to people and tell you. So what's the program about? Well, it's a bit like understanding the growth of a plant. So the first thing is, and if I can go back to some of that stuff about what is Hua Parakore, it's that you raise your own kumara tipu in tāpapa. So you raise them yourself. It's all of that stuff about from the beginning to the end. So when you say, I'd like to embark on a journey to become Hua Parakore certified so that I can use this logo, and I think there's only 4 organisations, 4 gardens that are currently Hua Parakore certified in the country. And one's a dairy farm, and she produces some wonderful liquid yogurt. Biofarms it's called. So the first thing you do is there's a nominal fee to sign up, and then you have Zoom calls every 2 months. So the beginning of the process in the first year, which is called Te Kākano, obviously, you prepare a kai production plan. So that asks all the questions that get at the 6 different categories of how you should garden, and you submit that at the end of your kākano period, and then you go into a period called tipuranga. Tipuranga is when you begin to refine all of that, and you get advice from the leaders about how to do that. And then finally, if you pass that stage, you go to puawai. And puawai is when you can actually demonstrate all of those things that are relative to your particular rohi, that are relative to your particular tikanga. Some of that's universal and some of it's unique. So, and then when you complete that, there's usually a visit by all people who are involved in Hua Parakore who can make it, and there's a bit of a celebration on your land. But from that point, you can use the tohu. And that's become increasingly important because in the free trade agreements with the European Union, there is a specific clause which gives respect to Indigenous production. And so if you can use that tohu, it can be extremely valuable. So that's Hua Parakore. I just want to talk a little bit about what we're doing at I'll just put the chair behind me. Okay. So this is a piece of land which should have come back to us at Ngāti Whātua after the Bastion Point, or Takaparafo as we call it. So that settlement gave back all the land that it could of those 600 acres. And that included Okahu Bay, if you know Okahu Bay. It included the prominent point where our marae sits today on Takaparafo, or the Whenua Rangatira. And it included this piece of land that we're looking at here, which is Paurewa. Paurewa was 30 odd acres, and we're only looking at the upper level of that land. So it's right in the middle of the city where Kepa Road and Kupe Street intersect, and Kupe Street runs right down to our marae. So there's a axis that sort of creates the relevance of that. So what we wanted to do was to create a māra that could actually interpret mātauranga Māori, but could also meet the contemporary needs of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei. So when I began the design, I had to consider a number of things, and the first thing was, the priority was to produce food for the whānau, good healthy food for the whānau, mahinga kai. So we took a flat area and The design of the garden is like this. That's the Marakai, which is in this area here, and it has paths that run true north, south, east, west. It's important to understand that, not because our tupuna understood the compass, it's because they would see Tamanui Te Rā start and rise over here in summer, midsummer, and rise over here in midwinter. And so the path of Tamanui Te Rā, when it rose, was also a tohu for this. And they knew when that line was directly in line with what we call east, that things were changing. So Tamanui Te Rā, the sun, was leaving his summer wife and heading off to his winter wife. So there's a mātauranga right there. They also understood a lot of things by direction, and what we plan to do is to put a plinth like that in the middle of this intersection, and it'll be that high and that round, and it will have the kainga of māramatanga around the outside. So that's there's a whole lot of other stories about this, but basically the stone from Mangawhau is here, and we're looking at other stories we can tell. For instance, we could have a po there representing Tamanui Te Rā to tell that particular story. So that's the Marakai. The other thing we planned to do was to have what we called a mātauranga, but of course, and I want to emphasise that rongoa is just as important as food. In fact, there's a whakatoaki that says he kai he rongoa, he kai. So they're the same thing because they nurture our bodies. And so what we've decided to do is, from a high point here, which is Korero, that's where they had a big lookout on a platform. They could look out over the land and see our people coming down from the north. And so what we've done with this area, we've got a large nursery here that produces 300,000 native plants a year for revegetating the land, but also the maunga and tamaki and other projects that the council might have. And this area here slopes down to the nursery, and it includes this area, which is a mātauranga and a māramatanga, which will be developed at that other end. So the paths from the lookout point go straight to our mountains, Mangawhau, Maungakea, Mangare, and a couple of other points which are important in our history. And so between the paths we've planted half of that now. We've planted that up with plants that treat a particular part of the tinama, the body. So the first part was the respiratory system. So it's things like kawakawa and I'm an old man, forgive me, every so often I forget my kupu. But a number of things, and then the second bed would be for bones, flesh and skin. There'll be areas for the digestive system, the nervous system, the reproductive system and so forth. So what we hope to do is to represent that in a way that helps the revival. You can put that down now, Fire, thank you. That reminds us really of how important rongoa has been. And you know, during COVID, people were able to get various tonics to help, particularly with respiratory problems. So kumaraho and tanikaha bark are a well-known remedy. Kumaraho is just a fabulous rongoa treatment. So so we were producing that for our whānau during that time. So when we gave out kai, when they came to get kai, we could give them a bottle of kumaraho. So that those remedies are tried and proven. And you know, it was in around 1907, the government of the day passed Tōhanga Suppression Act, which really drove all of the rongoa practice underground. And it's been, and while it was still there, people are more reliant on those remedies in our Māori world than they are on modern therapeutics. So they go to those things for remedies. So we're hoping to create a centre of excellence, but the thing that's different about this particular garden is that it will be interpreted, and in a sense we can't call it a mātauranga because the practitioners would go into Te Wānui o Tāne, into the forest, and in a sense they formed a relationship with the plants that they were looking at. And I've been in those areas with Donna Kerridge, who's a well-known rongoa practitioner, and Donna talks about how she creates that relationship, and she showed it to us. We've had about five or six programs with her. So you can't claim a more contrived garden like that a mātauranga. So we're just calling it a medicinal garden, but we'll have interpretation and we'll create a centre of excellence on Pauriwa in rongoa practice. So that goes to mirimiri and all of those things, but also those spiritual things that occur with a healer. But it's really important to understand that in your marakai is important too, that at least, and a good practitioner will only work with, I don't know, half a dozen plants really, because so many of those plants are universal. I talk about Oromahoe, it's really great for respiratory problems, but it's also really good for treating burns. And of course the mātauranga around that is that Oromahoe is notoriously difficult to grow in a nursery. I tell you, you'd have to sort of shove it under a bench and forget about it. But it is one of the quickest things to colonise a burnt over piece of land. So it comes up. So Fire Donna would say, well, that tells us two things. It first of all says, when you have fire, you have smoke. So that's about the respiratory system. But fire's hot and it burns, so that's about burns. But there's a lot of logic in those things, but that's the mātauranga around that particular thing. So as we progress with that work at Pauriwa and the marakai in particular, we're currently training. We have 5 gardeners there that we pay, but we give the kai away. So that's part of Orake's Trust Board's commitment to training their people and to growing free kai for their people as well. So I have currently 10 people doing primary industry training in either the nursery, in that marakai. We have a landscape group and we have an environment group that looks after our revegetation program. So they're all involved in those things. Look, that's sort of the basic knowledge I wanted to try and impart today. Can I just emphasise, I am not an expert. I'm somebody who's buried in this work and is really very passionate about it. And I think the thing that we've learnt most is to go back to some of the old ways in terms of growing. And you know, everybody makes a mistake in this field, in any field, and the thing is to learn from the mistake and move on. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. And I'm happy to have look at the whole idea that Graham wanted to engender, and thank you, Graham, for hosting this event, for you and Debbie. And I should acknowledge there are some people here who are very important in this movement, and I welcome you all warmly and say I'd really love to learn from you. So just discussions, anything people want to talk about. Kei a koe. Don't all talk at once.